For this last breakout session, you guys are stuck with me again. But this is a topic that I personally am very passionate about because I think it's something that modern Catholics have got to get a handle on. And so especially as catechists, we all share in the responsibility of helping people get a good handle on it. And that is the topic of faith and science, and how those two things go together. Because there are so many people, I mean, I know our young people specifically, there are so many young people that I work with that have so many questions about, has science disproven God? What does the church say about this thing or that thing? Or, if God created us, why do scientists say this? I really enjoy doing like question and answer nights with our youth group and confirmation and middle school folks. And those are honestly some of the most popular and most common questions. And so it's something that we all have to be able to answer. Because no matter what grade we're working with, whether it's kindergarten or it's an adult, we are going to be interacting with people who have questions about this. And so I want to kind of start at kind of the basic sense. And so we as people, as humanity, since the very beginning of time, both in Eastern culture and Western culture, people have always pursued knowledge about the world that they live in. That has always been the case. There have been certain questions that humanity has consistently asked throughout all cultures, throughout all points in history. And those are questions such as, like, who am I? Where have I come from? Where am I going? Why is there evil? What is after this life? And it's appropriate that we as humanity are asking those questions. Because the more that we learn about the world we live in and who we as individuals are, the more we understand how we've been created, and the more we come to recognize our uniqueness as created by God, the way that we are set aside for God. And of course, God the Father as creator has left his mark on all creation. And so we can get to know God the Father through observing creation. And so it's good that as humanity that we ask those questions. However, because these questions compel the human heart, most often where we go in our lives, the decisions we make in our lives, the life we choose to lead, is often decided by the answers we get to those questions. And so that means that it's all the more important that all people, no matter what their age, get good questions about who they are, or where they come from, or what's after this life, or why there's evil. Because most often those answers decide the people that they become, and the people that they choose to be, and the direction they choose to live their life. And so if the church isn't providing those answers, if we as catechists can't help guide people towards those answers, we also can't help them to lead their life in the right direction, a direction towards holiness, towards a relationship with God, towards sainthood. And especially since Vatican II, the church has talked about this a lot. John Paul II wrote a whole document called Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, about it. Pope Benedict, he gave several homilies during Advent, one of the first years he was Pope, talking about the story of creation and how it relates to science. There's a whole book that kind of consolidates all of those homilies. They're wonderful. And so the church has been talking about this. But that means that, or at least I should say, the church's leadership has been talking about this. But that means that those of us who also make up the church, the lay people, each and every person in this room, we have to be talking about it too. Because ultimately, we as disciples, we as catechists, are responsible for passing on the faith, passing on the deposit of faith, the truth, ultimately. We are entrusted with passing on the truth, and that responsibility that the church gives to every single person who plays a role in catechesis. And of course, Jesus is the fullness of truth. He tells us that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so we find the fullness of truth in Jesus. But even from the time of the Acts of the Apostles, evangelization has required that we draw on truth from the world we live in, from philosophy, from science, from social science, in order to draw on those areas of evidence to help compel those human hearts that maybe don't have a relationship with Jesus yet. And so we have to be people of truth and share that as disciples and catechists. And that means we have to have a handle on how faith and science go together. And the reality is that when it comes right down to it, they have to go together. They have to go hand in hand. Faith, good science, can never disprove our faith. Because science is the study of something physical. But science can't disprove God because God exists outside of the physical. So no matter what you combine in beakers in a chemistry lab, or no matter what you study in biology, you can never prove, or cannot prove or disprove God's existence. Simple as that. However, good science should always lead us to the truth of who God is, to the truth of who we are as people and who we are as God's creation. Faith and reason go hand in hand. And so with that, I first want to demonstrate to you the simple fact that for a very long time, the church has been pro-science. Because that's one of, probably the first step, is that there are so many people who think that the church is like, no, get science out of here, we don't want to deal with it. Now, it's fair to say that the church has said at times that it's not called to speak on areas of science. However, there are great people of science. And so let me introduce you to some of my friends here. The first one is Sister Mary Kenneth Keller. Sister Mary is famous for being the first female PhD in computer science. Now, when looking at her, you might not have guessed that, but I love that about her. In fact, some of the work she did with many others shaped the way that we use the internet today. In fact, Sister Mary helped write one of the earliest computer languages. It's just called BASIC. It's an acronym for something that I don't remember. But that same computer language that's used to program computers today, and write software today, has shaped the way that we use the internet and use various software. In fact, she even foretold of the existence of the internet. She guessed that something like the internet would exist and that it would transform the way that education happened. And boy, did she prove to be right this year. And so Sister Mary Keller transformed the world in computer science. But she also loved her faith, and she also loved Jesus. This friend over here, this is probably the one that many of you are most familiar with. I'm sure you talked about him in your biology class in high school. This is Father Gregor Mendel. He is famous for being the father of genetics. You might remember that he did an experiment on pea pods and growing pea pods, and the study that he did found that there were certain dominant and recessive genes that were passed on to the next plant. And so that transformed the way we understand genetics. And much of the food and things that we eat at the grocery store is made possible because of the way that they protect it against viruses and other diseases through genetics. Many of the ways that we protect ourselves and the way that we, understand our own existence and our own susceptibility to certain diseases and things from family history and the way that we live our lives to protect ourselves is much a result of the studies that he did. And then the last one, and you have to excuse me because my French isn't very good, is Father Georges Lemaitre. And I'm not going to say his last name anymore because I don't think I'm saying it right. But he is the original theorist. He was a theoretical physicist, and he was the first person to theorize that the beginning of the universe consisted of the Big Bang. And you might be asking yourself, well, gosh, a Catholic priest came up with that? But isn't that same theory that so many people say, oh, well then God must not have created the universe? That's the case. However, his theory differs quite a bit from the modern theory. And there's a reason for that. Because in Father George's theory, he proposed, and I'm going to read this exactly so I can keep it as accurate as possible. He proposed that that creation began with a primeval atom, which disintegrated in an explosion resulting in space-time and the expansion of the whole universe. And now you'll notice that he specifies that creation began with an atom. Well, we also know from the laws of physics proposed by Newton is that matter cannot be created nor destroyed. So where did that first atom come from? Well, he understood, and we as Catholics should understand, that if this theory is correct about the Big Bang, that first atom, that primeval atom, began with God. You know, of course, what is that first thing that God says in the creation story in Genesis? Let there be light. Absolutely. And when we talk about that disintegration of that first atom into space, time, and the expansion of the whole universe, guess what scientists proposed that consisted of a lot? A lot of light. And so the difference between the Big Bang theory that many people hold against creation and the version that we started with, and the version that meshes with good Catholicism and good faith and good science, is that the Big Bang also had a big banger. Someone who put it into motion. Someone who guided that process. We know that guy as God the Father. And so good science and responsible and well-informed faith go hand in hand. And that's important for us to know. And it doesn't always look that way at first glance. So we have to get a good handle on that. And that means we have to be people of faith, but we also have to be people who are looking into things like this. When we have questions, or when we know people who have questions, we have to play our part in helping them find those answers. And it's not always easy. How am I doing on time?
You're doing really well on time. You keep on going.
Fantastic. Great, because I got more to say. But I also want to say that science isn't the only problem. Because, you know, oftentimes as good Catholics, we look at scientists and say, oh, you know, they're out to disprove God and whatnot. But also, there's a lot of irresponsible Christians out there too, who disregard good science and shape their faith to fit what they think it has to. You know, there's a whole creationist museum out in California, which has displays of humanity walking alongside dinosaurs. Because of course, if you read the creation story very, very literally, it seems to indicate that the world is only 5,000 years old. And so if dinosaurs existed, humans must have walked alongside humans. And therefore, that's where we get the old mythological idea of dragons, because people way back walked alongside dinosaurs. I'm here to tell you that that's dumb. That is dumb, because the reality is that the book of Genesis, the story of creation, or at least the first 7 chapters of the book of Genesis, is not a science textbook. It's a book written to tell people about who they are and where they come from, and about a God who created them out of love, and a God who walked alongside them in the garden. And so it's not telling them that there was a primeval atom that disintegrated in an explosion and created space-time and the expansion of the universe. Instead, it tells the story poetically. And it tells the story that has significant truths in it, in that man and woman were created differently than the rest of creation, that we have an eternal soul, that we're given a free will and an intellect, and that we are loved by God. All of those things are true, and none of that takes away from anything theorized by Father Georges Lemaitre. And so we have to understand those things. So first, questions on that, because I just threw a lot at you. Yes, ma'am.
You said God poetically was talking about how man and women.
Mm-hmm.
And then, sorry, I didn't get the
So-
second.
Oh, no, that's okay. Now I have to remember what I said. So God tells us that man and woman are created differently and that we're given free will and intellect, that we are loved greatly by him, that he breathes life into us, or that we're given that eternal soul, which is different than the rest of creation. That's that most important part. And even when we look at the full story of creation, and the way that it develops, when we look at good science in and around the world of like evolution, there's good reason why those two things mesh as well. Now, again, much like the modern Big Bang Theory, there are potential traps and hazards in the theory of evolution when it comes to our faith. Because, of course, evolution did not happen by accident. We didn't just suddenly start walking around and God was like, well, by golly, it worked. Wow. No, what's the word I'm looking for? God guided that process. What's that?
Divine.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. In that God walked alongside that process. He didn't just put the world into motion and walk away and hope for the best. But instead, if evolution is in fact true, then we have to know that God walked alongside that process and guided that process and made sure that that process happened in the way that he had designed. Yes, ma'am.
About what era was Sister Mary?
Sorry?
About what time period was Sister Mary?
The main time that she was working in computer science was like just before, around like the late 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. She had a very long career. And so, I should say, I believe she started in school in the late 30s and 40s. Yeah. All right. Then, with that, the last thing I want to say is that we as catechists, we as disciples of Christ, if we hope to be making disciples, we have to have confidence in God's creation. We first have to have that confidence that God has a place among science. We have to have the confidence that science has not disproven God. It has to start with us. Much like a lot of other things in catechesis, it first has to start with us. And so for my first invitation to all of you is if you have questions on this stuff, seek out those answers. Find someone who can give those answers, or do your research and ask those questions. Don't just bury them deep inside, but seek out those answers. The second thing is that when you get questions about this from the people that you work with, whether they are young people or whether they're adults, don't shy away from those answers, but also don't make up an answer. And don't be afraid to say, you know what, I don't know that answer, let me get back to you. Or, I don't know that answer, let's try and find that answer together. Because ultimately that is our faith. Our faith consists of growth, always growing. And this is an area in which I think many modern Catholics need to grow, myself included. And so that is my encouragement to all of you, is to know that faith and reason go hand in hand. And when both are done well, they only help us to know God better and to know ourselves better. Amen?